The sky over the Arizona territory was the color of old brass, polished by a relentless sun that beat down like a hammer. Dust, finer than flour, coated everything inside the stagecoach, turning the red velvet seats a dull brown and gritting between Nora Hale's teeth. For 2 days, the world outside her window had been a searing panorama of red rock, skeletal saguaro, and the shimmering lie of water on the horizon. The heat baked the air out of a person's lungs, leaving only a dry, racking thirst that no amount of water from the canteen could truly quench. Nora, at 28 years of age, had seen her share of hardship. The fevers in the hospital tents during the epidemic had a smell, a thick, sweet odor of life giving up. This land had a smell too, of dust, creosote, and something ancient, like sun-bleached bone. She shifted on the seat, the heavy fabric of her traveling dress sticking to her skin. Beside her, resting in its sturdy leather case, was her camera, a big clumsy box of mahogany and brass. But to her, it was a tool of witness. It captured truth in slivers of light and shadow, a truth she hoped to sell to newspapers back east. Enough truth, and she could buy her own studio, a quiet place to frame the lives of others instead of chasing the ghost of her brothers. The official report called his death in the Mesilla silver mine an accident. Nora knew her brother. He was careful. Accidents didn't just happen to him. The only other passenger was a land agent from back east, a man whose sweat stained the collar of his city suit and whose constant nervous glances soured the air more than the heat. The driver and the shotgun guard sat up top, their voices a low murmur lost to the rhythmic creak of the suspension and the plodding of the 6-horse team. The attack came with the sudden violence of a summer storm. A rifle cracked, sharp and definitive, and the world dissolved into chaos. The coach lurched violently, throwing Nora against the sweating land agent. Wood splintered. A horse screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the gunfire. The agent fumbled for a pistol inside his coat, his face a mask of pasty fear. Outside, men were shouting in Spanish, their voices harsh and guttural. Nora's training took over. Years of nursing had taught her to push past fear, to move, to act. She shoved the heavy camera case under the seat for protection and pressed herself to the floor, pulling the whimpering agent down with her. A bullet punched through the side of the coach, showering them with splinters. Bandits. The agent gasped. Mexican bandits. The gunfire was a constant roar. The coach rocked to a halt. Hoofbeats circled them, and the Spanish commands grew louder, closer. The shotgun guard on top let out a choked cry, followed by a heavy thud. Silence from above. The driver was shouting, his voice tight with panic. "Take the box. Just take it and go." Nora risked a glance through the window. She saw men on horseback, their faces covered with dusty bandanas. They wore wide sombreros, their clothes ragged. It fit the stories she had heard, but something felt wrong, staged, too perfect in its details, like a photograph composed to tell a specific, misleading story. Then, from the rocks to the east, a new sound. Not a rifle, but a lower, heavier report. One of the circling riders grunted and fell from his saddle. The others wheeled their horses, confused, searching for the source of the new threat. Another shot, and a horse went down, kicking and screaming. The bandits' carefully constructed theater was falling apart. A figure emerged from the shimmering heat haze, moving with a fluid grace that seemed part of the land itself. He was tall and lean, his skin the color of the red earth. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple cotton shirt. A rifle was held loosely in his hands, but it was the knife at his belt that drew Nora's eye, its handle carved with the jagged shape of a lightning bolt. He was Apache, Chiricahua, by the look of his moccasins and the set of his shoulders. He moved without sound, using the sparse cover of scrub brush and rock. Another predator in a land full of them. The remaining ambushers, their confidence shattered, hesitated. One of them shouted, not in Spanish, but in frustrated, unaccented English. Where did he come from, get the safe? The word hung in the air. Safe. There was a small, iron strongbox bolted to the floor of the coach, hidden beneath a false bottom. The driver had mentioned it was carrying land deeds and surveys for the families near Cedar Bluff. The Apache man fired again. He wasn't aiming to kill now, but to disrupt. A shot kicked up dust in front of a horse, making it rear. Another splintered the rifle stock of one of the riders. He was driving them, herding them, exposed and unnerved. The attackers broke. They spurred their horses and fled back down the trail, a disorganized rout. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded horse and the ragged breathing of the man beside her. Nora slowly pushed herself up. The Apache warrior stood motionless by the rocks, his rifle held at ease, watching the dust settle. He was not looking at the coach, but at the ground, his eyes tracking something only he could see. The driver, a tough old man named Elias, climbed down from his seat, his face pale. The shotgun guard, a boy no older than 20, was dead. Nora grabbed her medical bag, the worn leather familiar in her hands. Instinct carried her out of the coach and toward Elias, whose arm was bleeding freely from a deep gash. "Let me see that," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. While she cleaned and bandaged the wound, the Apache approached. He moved with a quiet intensity, his gaze missing nothing. He knelt not by the fallen guard, but by the boot prints left in the dust. "Not bandits," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. They spoke Spanish, Elias insisted, wincing as Nora tightened the bandage. The man pointed with his chin. "They wear factory boots. From a catalog, and their curses were from Chicago, not Chihuahua." He picked up a spent cartridge casing from the dust and held it out. "This is from a Winchester rifle, model of 1886. New, not the old Army surplus guns bandits use." He let the casing drop. This was a performance. Nora finished her work and stood, meeting the man's eyes for the first time. They were dark and intelligent, and they held a deep, weary suspicion. He looked from her to the camera case Elias was now pulling from the coach. "What is in the box?" the Apache asked. "Land papers," Elias said, his voice grim. "Deeds for the Romero family, the Apodakas, proof of ownership of the Red Spring watershed." The man's expression didn't change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. "Vexler," he said. The name was a curse. Silas Vexler, the railroad man. Nora had heard the name whispered all the way from San Miguel. Vexler and Pacific was carving its way across the territory, and it needed water. Red Spring was the only reliable source for 50 miles, and rumor in Cedar Bluff held that Vexler's lawyers were finding ways to declare the old Spanish and native claims invalid, driven by an instinct she couldn't name. Nora retrieved her camera. Her hands were shaking, but she worked methodically, preparing a plate. The light was harsh, but she could make it work. "I need to document this," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. The Apache watched her, his face a mask of disapproval, a box to capture shadows. "It captures truth," she countered, focusing the lens on the dead horse. One of the fleeing men had been riding it. The brand on its flank was clear, a simple V and P intertwined. Vexler and Pacific. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took the photograph. Then she saw something else. One of the fallen attackers, the one the Apache had shot first, had worn a plain blue armband on his left sleeve. It seemed insignificant, but it was a detail. The camera saw everything. She took another photograph. "Your truth is not the only one," the man said, his voice quiet but sharp. He gestured toward the dead guard. "Your shadow box will not bring him back. It will not make water run." "It might keep men like Vexler from stealing it," she retorted, sliding the exposed plate into its protective sleeve. "Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and my camera lets in the sun." He gave a short, humorless laugh. The sun in this land also kills. They stood there in the oppressive heat. Two people from different worlds, bound by a violence neither had sought. She, a woman who believed in the power of a captured image, of evidence laid bare for all to see. He, a man who believed in the strength of his arm and the knowledge of the land. His name, she learned from Elias, was Koso Nantan, a Chiricahua warrior who had once scouted for the army that hunted his own people, a compromise made to protect a small piece of what was left. Now he protected the water that gave his people life. "We cannot stay here," Koso said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The ones who ran will report back to their master. He will send more." He looked at Nora's bandaged work on the driver's arm. The other passenger had a shallow wound on his leg. "You have skill with wounds." "I was a nurse," she said simply. "My camp is half a day's ride from here. There is water. The wounded can be tended to by our healer." Elias looked torn. "My orders are to get to Cedar Bluff." "Your orders got one man killed," Koso said, his words blunt. "The road to Cedar Bluff will be watched. My way will not." The conflict was plain. Trust a man with a tomahawk at his belt, or trust the men who had just tried to kill them and would likely try again. Nora looked at the knife at Koso's hip, the lightning bolt a symbol of sudden, dangerous power. Then she looked at her camera, its brass lens like a great, unblinking eye. One protected life by taking it. The other sought to protect it by revealing truth. For now, it seemed, their paths were forced to run together. "He's right, Elias," Nora said, making the decision. "We have to get off this road." Koso nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture. "Gather what you need. We move when the sun begins to fall." He walked over to the dead guard and, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his fierce demeanor, closed the young man's eyes. Nora looked at Koso, then at the land agent who was staring at the Apache warrior as if he were a ghost. She felt a profound sense of unease. Her goal had been simple: take photographs, earn money, find answers about her brother. Now she was caught in something far larger. A storm of greed and violence centered on a trickle of water in the middle of a vast, unforgiving desert. Koso turned back to her, his gaze lingering for a moment on her camera. "I survived by not believing in the white man's truth," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "And I photograph it," she replied, her chin lifting slightly. "Perhaps we'll see which one holds up better in the light." Cedar Bluff was less a town than a scar on the land. A single dusty street of false-fronted buildings huddled against the immense, indifferent landscape of rock and sun. It smelled of horse manure, stale beer, and the pervasive dust that was its foundation and its shroud. Silas Vexler's presence was a palpable weight here. The new Vexler and Pacific Railroad office, with its large plate-glass windows, stared down the length of the street like a predator. Freshly painted signs in the saloon offered cheap whiskey to the miners Vexler had brought in. Men with hard eyes and soft hands that had never held a pickaxe, telegraph poles, stark and unnatural, marched alongside the iron rails, humming with the business of a world that was consuming this one. Koso had led them into town under the cover of a moonless night, moving through the shadows with the ease of a spirit. He left Nora at the boarding house, a promise to return hanging unspoken in the air between them. Her room was small and clean, with a window that looked out onto the main street. It was here, in a cramped closet sealed with blankets against the light, that she created her dark room. The sharp, clean smell of the chemicals was a comfort, a familiar scent from a life of order and science. Under the ghostly red glow of her safe light, the images from the ambush slowly emerged from the ether. She watched, her breath held, as the silver salts bloomed on the glass plates. First, the stark, brutal image of the dead guard. Then, the fallen horse. She leaned closer, her heart quickening, the brand on its flank resolved into perfect clarity, the intertwined V and P of Vexler and Pacific. It was the proof she needed, a direct link. Then came the second plate, the one she had taken of the fallen attacker. The blue armband on his sleeve seemed to stand out against the monochrome landscape. It was a detail, but her reporter's instinct told her it was an important one. She worked through the night, making prints, her mind racing. The truth was here, captured in light and chemistry. The next morning, the town's tension was a low hum in the air. Pinned to the public notice board outside the sheriff's office was a document, its legal language dense and intimidating. It was a formal application by the Vexler and Pacific Railroad for control of the Red Spring watershed, citing the doctrine of public utility. A map was attached, crudely drawn and blatantly false, showing the spring as an isolated water source, conveniently omitting the network of ancient channels that fed the ranches of the Romero and Apodaca families, and the lands used by Coso's people. In the margins of the application, the native population was referred to as a transient and non-domiciled presence, effectively erasing their history and their rights from the official record. "It's thievery with a fancy seal," a deep voice rumbled beside her. Nora turned to see a mountain of a man, his skin the color of rich, dark earth. He stood before a smithy, the heat from the forge shimmering around him. He was Isaiah Reed, a former soldier for the Union, now the town's blacksmith. His arms, bare to the shoulder, were corded with muscle, and his eyes held a steady, assessing calm. "They are trying to steal the water in broad daylight," Nora said, her voice tight with anger. Isaiah wiped a hand across his brow. Daylight, moonlight, it's all the same to men like Vexler. He bought Sheriff Cobb months ago, and the bank inspector, Mr. Dalton, eats out of his hand. This paper is just the ceremony after the wedding. The system was compromised. A web of corruption spun from Vexler's money. Her photograph suddenly felt like a very small stone to throw at such a giant. Still, it was the only stone she had. The thought of her brother, Daniel, flashed in her mind. He had believed in doing the right thing, in standing up to bullies. It had gotten him killed in a mine owned by a man just like Vexler. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a voice whispering for her to be careful, to walk away. But another voice, Daniel's voice, urged her forward. That afternoon, she met with Coso at the edge of town, near a grove of cottonwoods that survived on some hidden seep. He had been meeting with the elders of his own small band and the larger Chiricahua Council. His face was grim, carved with a new weariness. "The council wants to move," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "They say we cannot fight the railroad. They would have us take the women and children north, to wait until the trouble passes." "And what do you say?" Nora asked. "I say that to leave the water is to lose our soul," he answered, his voice low and fierce. "Trouble does not pass. It settles. It takes root. I have seen it before." He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a deep, old wound in his eyes. "When I was younger, I scouted for the army. I showed them the trails, the hidden springs. I did it because they promised food, protection for our families who were starving. I traded my honor for their lies." He looked away again. "I will not lead my people away from their lifeblood again. I will not retreat." His words resonated with her own internal struggle. To expose the truth was her duty, but it meant putting herself in the path of the same kind of danger that had killed her brother. To do nothing was to be safe, but it was also a betrayal of everything she believed in, and a betrayal of Daniel's memory. "I have something," she said, pulling a print from her satchel. She showed him the photograph of the horse brand, Vexler's men. Coso studied the image, his expression unreadable. He then looked at the second photograph, the one with the blue armband. He reached out and touched the image of the band with the tip of one finger. "This is the sign of the Pinkerton Agency, Vexler's private army." He looked up at her. "This piece of paper is more dangerous than a loaded gun." "I mean to use it," she said. "I'll send it to the territorial newspapers. I'll send it to every official I can find." His dark eyes held hers. "And they will try to stop you." His prediction came to pass with unnerving speed. That evening, As she left the boarding house, she felt eyes on her. Two men, the same men she had seen loafing outside the saloon, watched her from across the street. They were dressed as miners, but they had the watchful stillness of predators. A chill went down her spine. The town no longer felt small. It felt claustrophobic, a cage. The next day, a package arrived for her at the stagecoach office. It contained no letter, only a single, spent ammunition casing, identical to the ones Koso had found at the ambush site. She recognized the maker's mark on the bottom, a small V inside a circle. It matched the inventory stamp on the crates she had seen behind Wexler's warehouse. The message was clear. We know who you are. We know what you have. The fear was a constant companion now, a cold presence at the back of her neck. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every footstep behind her on the boardwalk made her jump. That night, she was working late in her dark room, making copies of the prints. When she heard a noise from her bedroom, she froze, the glass plate heavy in her hand, the slow creak of a floorboard. Someone was in her room. She doused the safe light, plunging the closet into absolute darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure they could hear it. She held her breath, listening. She heard the quiet scrape of a drawer being opened, the rustle of her belongings being searched. They were looking for the plates. Rage, cold and sharp, cut through her fear. This was her space, her life they were violating. She had faced down death in fever tents. She would not be cowed by Wexler's thugs. Her hand closed around a heavy glass bottle of fixer solution. She waited, every muscle tensed, after what felt like an eternity. She heard the floorboards creak again as the intruder moved back toward the door, and then the soft click of the latch. She waited another 10 minutes, her ears straining in the silence, before she dared to move. When she finally opened the closet door, the scene that greeted her sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. Her room had been ransacked. Her trunk was open, its contents strewn across the floor. The mattress had been slashed. They had been thorough, but they had not found what they were looking for. Before leaving that morning, acting on a premonition, she had hidden the original glass plates and the best of the prints with the only person in town she trusted. They were safe, wrapped in oilcloth, at the bottom of a sack of nails in Isaiah Reed's smithy. She sank onto the edge of her ruined bed, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. The game had changed. She was no longer just a witness recording events. She was a player, a target. Wexler was not just trying to steal water. He was trying to silence the truth, and he was willing to go to any length to do it. The memory of her brother's face, laughing in the sunlight just before he left for Massilia, filled her mind. This was for him now, too. This was for every quiet voice Wexler had ever tried to crush. She took a deep, steadying breath. Her fear was still there, but now it had a hard, sharp edge. It had become a weapon. The drought did not arrive like a storm. It seeped into the land. A slow thief of life, the sun, a merciless white disk in a brass sky, baked the earth into a cracked mosaic. Red spring, the lifeblood of the valley, shrank daily, its edges receding to expose a muddy, alkaline wound. Cattle, their ribs stark against their hides, stood listless near the sluggish water, too weak to fend off the flies. The people watched, their faces etched with the same worried lines as the dry earth. Then came the fence. It appeared overnight, a cruel steel spine of barbed wire glinting in the sun, strung between heavy posts that Wexler's men had driven deep into the ground. It encircled the spring, cutting it off from the ranches and the Apache camps, declaring it the sole property of the railroad. It was a declaration of war, written in wire and wood. Word of the fence traveled on the hot wind, a whisper of outrage that reached Nora in her small boarding house room. She packed her camera equipment, her hands moving with a grim purpose. This was not a story to be told in words alone. She found a high vantage point in the rocks overlooking the spring, a natural blind shielded by yucca and creosote. From there, she watched for 2 days, the heat pressing down on her like a physical weight. On the 3rd day, she saw them. 3 of Vexler's hired men rode up to the fence line. They were not there to guard it. They dismounted and pulled heavy canvas sacks from their pack mules. With furtive glances toward the empty landscape, they untied the sacks and began dumping a foul, grayish powder into the heart of the spring. The water swirled with the poison, turning a sick, milky color. Nora's breath caught in her throat. This was more than theft. It was desecration. It was a promise that if Vexler could not have the water, no one would. Her hands, slick with sweat, moved with practiced speed. She changed plates, adjusted her focus, and began taking photographs, one after another. Click. The men pouring the powder. Click. The unnatural cloud spreading through the water. Click. Their faces, smug and certain in their act of destruction. She created a sequence, a silent moving picture of their crime, capturing the truth frame by agonizing frame. That evening, a council of war was held not with drums and rifles, but in the quiet, herb-scented kitchen of Doña Luz Romero. Doña Luz, a woman whose age was impossible to guess, was the matriarch of the valley, a healer whose knowledge of plants and people was a law unto itself. Her rancho was a sanctuary, a place where the lines between Anglo, Mexican, and Apache blurred. She tended to everyone with the same steady hands, her presence a balm on the raw nerves of the community. Nora laid her prints on the heavy wooden table. The images were stark and undeniable. Koso stood beside her, his face a mask of cold fury. Isaiah Reed was there, his big hands gentle as he examined the photographs. A young girl of about 10, with Koso's dark eyes and hair the color of sunlit corn, moved between them, translating Koso's quiet Apache observations into Spanish for Doña Luz, and then into English for Nora y Hero and Isaiah. Her name was Dawn, and she was the bridge between their worlds. "This is the devil's work," Doña Luz said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "It is Vexler's work," Isaiah corrected, his voice a low rumble, "and it needs to be undone." They made a plan in the flickering candlelight. Koso would lead a small party of his best men. They would move after the moon had set. The objective was simple: cut the fence, unblock the small dam the men had made to concentrate the poison, and flush the spring with cleaner water from higher up. Koso's primary rule was absolute. No one was to be killed. Vexler's guards were to be neutralized, their weapons taken, but they were to be left unharmed. "We are not murderers," he said, his eyes meeting Nora's. "We are freeing the water." "I'm coming with you," Nora stated. It was not a question. Koso started to object, but Isaiah laid a hand on his arm. "She's not a fighter. Koso, she's a witness. The world needs witnesses." "I can be a lookout," Nora insisted. "My eyes are good. I can watch the trail from the depot." Koso studied her for a long moment, then gave a single, reluctant nod. The desert night was a world of sharp contrasts. The stars were a brilliant, thick spill of salt across a black velvet sky. The air, finally cool, carried the clean, resinous scent of creosote and the distant, lonely call of a coyote. Against this profound natural beauty, the yellow lights of the Cedar Bluff Depot and Vexler's office were a garish, unnatural stain. Nora lay flat on a rocky outcrop, her small field glasses pressed to her eyes. Below her, she could see Koso and his 3 men moving like wraiths through the shadows. They made no sound, their moccasins leaving barely a trace in the dust. She watched the depot, her gaze fixed on the telegraph office, looking for any sign of an alarm. The silence was immense, a living thing that pressed in on her. She saw the guards near the fence, 2 of them, huddled around a small fire. Koso's men separated, circling around them. There was a sudden flurry of movement in the darkness, a muffled grunt, and then stillness. When Nora looked back, the guards were gone from the firelight. and Koso's men were at the fence with heavy wire cutters Isaiah had forged for them. Snap, snap, snap. The sound of the wire parting was shockingly loud in the quiet. They worked quickly, rolling back the barbs, creating a wide opening. Then they moved to the spring itself, breaking the small, crude dam and clearing the poisoned sludge. The clean water, released from its confinement, surged forward, washing over the filth, beginning the slow, arduous process of healing. Back at Doña Luz's rancho before dawn, there was a quiet sense of triumph. Doña Luz made coffee and fry bread, and, for a moment, the tension eased. "This is not how my mother made it," Koso said, examining a piece of the puffy, golden bread with mock seriousness. Doña Luz swatted at him with a towel. "Your mother used bear fat? I use lard. My bread does not taste of angry animals." The good-natured argument brought a smile to Nora's face. She was exhausted, but she felt a sense of belonging that was entirely new. Later, as Dawn helped her clean her camera plates, Nora tried to thank Koso in his own language. She had asked Dawn to teach her a simple phrase for good morning. She looked at Koso and said the words carefully. A strange expression crossed his face, and Dawn burst into a fit of giggles. "What did I say?" Nora asked, her cheeks flushing. "You have just informed him," Dawn said, catching her breath, "that his horse is on fire." Koso's stern face broke into a rare, genuine smile. The laughter that followed was a release, a small moment of light in the gathering darkness. But the darkness was not far off. On Sunday, Father Michael delivered a sermon about obedience to the law and the sanctity of private property. He spoke of progress and the civilizing influence of the railroad, his eyes carefully avoiding the faces of the Romero and Apache families in the pews. After the service, Nora confronted him outside the small adobe church. "How can you speak of sanctity when Wexler's men poisoned the water God gave to this valley?" The priest's face stiffened. "The law is the law. Miss Hale, it is not the place of the church to interfere in legal disputes." Even when the law is being used as a weapon for theft, she challenged, "The law is written by men, Father, and the men writing it here are paid by Silas Wexler." She turned and walked away, his platitudes ringing hollow in her ears. The true scope of Wexler's plan became clear a few days later. One of Koso's cousins, who worked on the railroad survey crew, brought him a map. It was a new route proposal, one that straightened a curve in the tracks to save Wexler a small amount of money. The new line cut directly through a quiet, secluded canyon, a canyon that was the ancient burial ground of Koso's ancestors. To break ground there, Wexler needed a legal document, a formal statement from the tribe and any other interested parties that the land was no longer in use for sacred purposes, a waiver of worship. It was an unthinkable desecration, an attempt to erase not just their present, but their past as well. The fight was no longer just about water, which was life. Now it was about their very soul. They were all gathered again at Isaiah's smithy, the map spread out on the anvil. When the blow fell, one of the Romero boys came running, his face pale with terror. He had been playing with Dawn down by the creek. Two men had ridden up, the men with the blue armbands. They had grabbed Dawn, thrown her onto a horse, and ridden away. They had left a message, shouted over their shoulders as they disappeared into the dust. If the Apache wanted to see the girl again, Koso was to sign the paper giving up the spring and the burial ground. He had until noon the next day. The news of Dawn's abduction struck the small group like a physical blow, sucking the air from the blacksmith's shop. Koso's face became a mask of stone, but a fire Nora had not seen before burned in the depths of his eyes. There was no panic, only a terrifying, focused calm. He did not speak. He simply moved, gathering a water skin and checking the knife at his belt. His cousin, the one who had brought the map, pointed a shaking finger to the northwest. They rode toward the old Messilia Road. The name hit Nora like a fist to the stomach. The Messia mine, the abandoned silver claim where her brother, Daniel, had died. The place she had traveled 1,000 miles to understand, and the one place she had dreaded seeing. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. Koso turned to her, his gaze intense. "This is not a place for a camera." "Dawn is my friend," she replied, meeting his stare without flinching. "And that place, it owes me answers." He saw the resolve in her face, a mirror of his own, and gave a sharp, single nod. They rode hard, Koso on his wiry pony and Nora on a horse borrowed from the Romero stables. Koso did not follow the road. He cut across the open country, his eyes fixed on the ground, reading a story in the scuffed earth and displaced stones that was invisible to Nora. He was a force of nature, a hunter on his own terms, and she followed in his wake, her own grief and fear a cold, hard knot inside her. The Mesilia mine was a gaping wound in the side of a barren mountain, a place of ghosts and bad memories. The headframe stood like a gallows against the pale sky, its timbers bleached and splintered. A few derelict shacks leaned at weary angles, their windows like vacant eyes. The silence was profound, unnatural. Koso dismounted, placing a hand on his horse's muzzle to quiet it. He moved toward the entrance of the main shaft, his body low to the ground, every line of him radiating a lethal readiness. He pointed to a set of fresh tracks, 2 horses shod, one set of smaller, scuffing prints between them. Dawn's. They had taken her inside. The thought of that bright, brave little girl in the suffocating darkness of the mine filled Nora with a cold dread that was sharper than any fear for herself. They entered the mine, leaving the world of sunlight and heat behind. The air inside was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet rock, stale air, and something else, the faint, acrid scent of blasting powder. Koso lit a small, shielded lantern, its light a feeble challenge to the immense darkness. They moved down the main tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The timber supports groaned around them, ancient bones complaining under the weight of the mountain. They found Dawn in a side chamber, a storeroom carved from the rock. She was tied to a support beam, a gag in her mouth, but her eyes were wide and fierce. 2 of Wexler's men were there, the foreman a burly man with a cruel mouth and the other a younger, nervous type. They were arguing in low voices. Wexler said to hold her until he gets the papers signed. The younger one fretted. "And I say we get rid of the evidence now," the foreman growled. "The whole mine. He'll thank us later." He held up a coil of fuse. At that moment, Koso moved. He was not a man anymore, but a shadow, a blur of motion detaching itself from the deeper darkness of the tunnel. He struck the younger man with the butt of his rifle, a single, precise blow that sent him crumpling to the floor. The foreman roared, turning and fumbling for his pistol. Nora didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy iron drill steel from the floor and swung it with all her strength, catching the foreman across the back of his knees. He howled in pain and staggered, his shot going wide, the bullet screaming off the rock wall. Koso was on him, disarming him with brutal efficiency. Within seconds, the foreman was on the ground, his own bandana stuffed in his mouth as a gag, his hands bound tightly behind him. Nora rushed to Dawn, her fingers fumbling with the knots. The moment the gag was out, Dawn gasped for air, her small body trembling. "They were going to blow up the mine," she whispered, her eyes huge in the lantern light. As Koso secured their prisoners, Nora's gaze fell upon a heavy wooden door at the back of the chamber, a door she had not noticed before. It was bolted from the outside, driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge. She slid back the heavy iron bolt. The door creaked open, revealing not another tunnel, but a small, dry room. It was an office, a desk, a chair, and shelves lined with dusty ledgers and boxes of documents. It was Wexler's secret heart, the place where he kept his sins. Koso brought the lantern closer. Nora's hands shook as she opened the first ledger. It was a ghost payroll, listing dozens of miners who didn't exist, Their wages funneled directly back to Wexler and his cronies, including Sheriff Cobb and the bank inspector. Dalton. There were forged contracts, deeds to land signed with the crudix of men who had been dead for years. It was the blueprint of his entire criminal enterprise. Then she saw a smaller, leather-bound book shoved to the back of a shelf. Her breath caught. She recognized the tooling on the cover. It was her brother's journal. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely open it. His familiar, neat handwriting filled the pages. He wrote of his work as an assayer for the mine. His initial excitement turning to suspicion. He had discovered the foreman was systematically mixing low-grade, toxic ore in with the high-grade silver shipments, a scam that defrauded the investors and poisoned the smelter workers downriver. Daniel had written that he was going to expose it. The last entry was dated the day he died. I have confronted the foreman. He wrote, "He knows that I know. I have hidden this journal and the assay reports. If you are reading this, it is because the worst has happened. It was no accident." Nora sank to the floor. The journal clutched to her chest. The sound that escaped her was a raw, ragged sob of grief and rage. The abstract quest for justice had become a burning, personal crusade for vengeance. All this time, she had carried the guilt of leaving home, of not being there for him. The guilt was still there, but now it was forged into something harder, something sharp. "Nora!" Koso's voice was gentle, his hand on her shoulder. Before she could answer, a low rumble shook the entire mine. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. "The fuse," Koso said, his voice grim. "The foreman must have lit it before we entered." They had to get out. Nora shoved the journal and two of the most damning ledgers into her satchel. She grabbed her camera, then stopped. It was too bulky, too heavy. She couldn't abandon it. Not the tool of her trade, the eye that saw the truth. With a cry of frustration, she twisted the heavy brass lens from its housing and shoved it into her pocket, leaving the wooden body of the camera behind like a shed skin. The rumbling grew louder. The ground began to shake violently. They ran, Koso half carrying Dawn, Nora scrambling behind them. They reached the main tunnel and saw, to their horror, that a section of the overhead shoring had collapsed, creating a chasm over a deep, dark shaft. The only way across was a single, rotting timber beam. "I will take the girl first," Koso said. He moved across the beam with the sure-footedness of a mountain cat, Dawn clinging to his back. He set her down on the other side and turned back for Nora. "I can't," she breathed, staring at the drop. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "Look at me." She took a hesitant step onto the beam. It swayed sickeningly. A tremor stronger than the others hit, and the beam cracked. She cried out, stumbling backward. The whole tunnel was groaning, threatening to collapse. "There is no time," Koso said. He leaped back across the chasm, landing lightly beside her. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She was shocked by his strength. He held her tight against his chest and started back across. She closed her eyes, her face pressed against the rough cotton of his shirt, smelling the clean scent of dust and sweat, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her ear. They were halfway across when the beam shattered. For a heart-stopping moment, they were falling. Then Koso's feet found purchase on a lower ledge, and he pushed off, launching them toward the other side. They landed in a heap, Nora's satchel spilling its contents. The ledgers fell into a pool of stagnant, muddy water. Behind them, the mine erupted in a deafening roar. A blast of hot, dust-filled air surged down the tunnel, throwing them forward. The world became a storm of noise and darkness and choking grit. When it was over, the tunnel behind them was gone, completely sealed by tons of fallen rock. Wexler's secrets were buried. They stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, gasping for air, their lungs burning, their hands raw and scraped. They were alive. "If we survive this," Nora coughed, her voice a raw rasp, I am going to demand a cup of coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon." Koso managed a faint smile, his face caked with grime. "I would settle for clean water." As she gathered the dripping ledgers and her brother's journal, her hand brushed against the small leather pouch Koso wore around his neck. A flicker of movement inside it caught her eye. It was his mother's talisman, a smooth river stone carved with the symbol of a lightning bolt. "Thunder guards the water," he had once told her. It was a promise of protection. She looked from the sacred stone to the wet, ruined ledgers in her hands, then at the camera lens in her pocket. She made a vow, a silent promise to her brother, to Koso, and to the land itself. She would not let the truth be buried. "I will not let my pictures, or anyone else's lies, take the water from your people ever again," she whispered. By the time they reached the relative safety of the foothills, the news had already poisoned the town. Sheriff Cobb, with a theatrical display of outrage, had declared the Mesilla mine collapse an act of terrorism. He named Koso as the ringleader and Nora Hale as his accomplice, accusing them of trying to destroy railroad property. Wanted posters were already being printed. There was a bounty on Koso's head. The town, already fractured, was now split wide open. They were resting in a hidden arroyo, exhausted and disheartened, when a small figure appeared on the ridge above them. It was Dawn. She had not waited for them, but had run, using her own knowledge of the land to circle back to Doña Luz's rancho and then find them. She scrambled down the slope, her face alive with urgent news. "It wasn't just about the papers," she said, her words tumbling out. "Vexler is bringing a judge. A special train is coming from Santa Fe in 2 days. He's going to hold a court on the railroad car and make it all legal. Right there at Red Spring. The trap was not a piece of paper. It was the law itself, arriving on an iron horse." The plan was forged in the smoky heat of Isaiah Reed's smithy, the only place in Cedar Bluff secure enough for them to meet. Dawn's news had stripped away any last vestiges of hope for a simple solution. Vexler was not just stealing their land. He was bringing the full force of a corrupt legal system to sanctify the theft. They were fighting not just a man, but an engine of progress that would grind them under its wheels without a second thought. "We have to fight on 2 fronts, Nora said, her voice clear and steady in the tense silence. She had spent the night carefully drying the pages of her brother's journal and the soaked ledgers, her grief a cold, hard stone in her chest. One front is the law, the other is the land. She looked at Koso, whose face was a study in controlled intensity. "You know the land. Your task is to stop that train, not to destroy it, not to harm anyone, but to delay it. You have to prevent that sham court from ever convening at Red Spring." Then she turned to Isaiah. "My front is the truth. I will take the photographs, the copies of the ledgers, and my brother's journal. I will ride to San Miguel and get them to a territorial marshal who isn't in Vexler's pocket. I'll send them to every newspaper between here and St. Louis. We have to show everyone what Vexler is before that judge's train ever gets moving." It was a desperate plan, a long shot fired into the dark, but it was the only one they had. Doña Luz, who had come into town under the pretense of selling her herbs, nodded her approval. She had already begun preparing for the aftermath, her bags filled with clean linen for bandages and jars of willow bark tonic for pain and fever. Her presence was a quiet testament to the reality of their plan. She knew there would be a price paid in blood. Isaiah stoked his forge, the embers glowing like a dragon's eye in the gloom. "Stopping a train is one thing. Stopping it without sending it off the rails into a canyon is another." He picked up a heavy piece of steel. "But I have an idea. Not a stick of dynamite. Something smarter." For the rest of the day, the ring of his hammer was the sound of their defiance, shaping a large, cleverly tapered steel wedge designed to jam a locomotive's driving axle, bringing it to a grinding, shuddering, but ultimately safe halt. The internal conflict came that evening, in the hidden Apache camp. A young warrior named Nako, his face alight with the fire of righteous anger, argued for a direct assault. "We should meet them with rifles," he urged the elders. Show them this is our land. We have been pushed back long enough. It is time to fight as our fathers fought. Koso listened patiently, his arms crossed over his chest. When Nako had finished, Koso spoke, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight of authority that came from a place of deep pain. I have seen what happens when we fight as our fathers fought. I have seen our women and children starving in the hills because the army burns our fields. I have led those soldiers. Nako, I carry the shame of it every day. I traded blood for bread, and the bread was always full of worms. He straightened, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his people. Justice does not come from the barrel of a gun. It comes from preventing the gun from ever being fired. We will stop this train. We will protect our land. But we will do it without becoming the murderers they claim we are. There will be no killing. Nora, standing at the edge of the firelight, felt a profound respect for him. He was not just a warrior fighting for his home. He was a leader struggling to build a future, one that was not poisoned by the same cycle of violence that had defined his past. His strategy was hers, a belief in the power of light to expose the darkness. And in that moment, their alliance felt like something more, a true meeting of minds and spirits. The next 24 hours were a blur of tense preparation. As the sun began to set on the day the train was due, casting long, purple shadows from the mesas, the air grew thick and heavy. A strange, oppressive stillness settled over the land. Far to the south, the sky flickered with silent, jagged spears of light, dry thunder. The air smelled of dust and ozone, and the tall grass, cured to a crisp yellow by the drought, was as flammable as tinder. The land itself felt like it was holding its breath. They stood on a ridge overlooking Thunder Canyon, the narrow pass where the tracks made a sharp, blind turn. This was where they would make their stand. The special train, with its single passenger car for the judge and a flatbed carrying a squad of Vexler's Pinkertons, was due within the hour. Nora was preparing to leave for her own desperate ride to San Miguel. She had her satchel with the evidence, and she had borrowed a new camera in town, a smaller, less conspicuous model. She turned to Koso as he checked his rifle one last time. His long, black hair was unbound, ruffled by the hot, gusting wind. On an impulse, a small, absurd gesture of normalcy in a world gone mad, she said, "You should at least comb your hair. You might end up in the newspapers." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He looked at her, and the weariness in his eyes was momentarily replaced by a warm, gentle light. "My hair, Nora Hale," he said, his voice a low rumble, "will make that judge run back to Santa Fe faster than a stopped train ever could." The moment of levity passed, leaving a charged silence in its wake. He reached out and touched the camera she was carrying. "Be careful with your truth," he said softly. "And you with yours," she replied. Their eyes held for a beat too long, an unspoken acknowledgement of the thread that now bound them, a thread woven of shared danger and a fierce, mutual respect. Then she turned her horse and rode east, toward the faint lights of the distant town, not allowing herself to look back. The wait in the canyon was agonizing. Koso and his men, along with Isaiah, concealed themselves in the rocks above the tracks. The wind shifted, blowing fitfully, carrying the scent of rain that would never fall. Then they heard it, a low, rhythmic chuffing that grew steadily louder, a mechanical heartbeat in the body of the night. The locomotive's headlamp cut a bright, searching beam through the darkness, sweeping across the canyon walls. As the train entered the tightest part of the curve, slowing its speed, Isaiah moved. He slid down the scree slope, a shadow among shadows, and, with a grunt of effort, hammered his steel wedge deep into the mechanism of the driving wheels. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The train screamed, a piercing shriek of tortured metal that echoed off the canyon walls. Sparks flew from the wheels, showering the dry grass below. The entire train bucked and shuddered, the passenger car swaying wildly, but the couplings held with a final, groaning sigh. The locomotive ground to a halt, steam hissing from its boiler in furious white plumes. For a moment, there was silence. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, not from the train, but from the rocks on both sides of the canyon. Wexler had anticipated them. A second force of Pinkertons had been lying in wait. They were caught in a crossfire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Koso, kicking up dust and stone chips. One of his men cried out and fell back, clutching his leg. Isaiah, exposed on the tracks below, was an easy target. A rifle shot spun him around, and he collapsed onto the gravel of the rail bed, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. Koso laid down a covering fire, his shots precise, aimed not at the men but at the rocks near them, forcing them to keep their heads down. He saw a young Pinkerton, barely a man, lose his footing on the edge of the flatbed car and tumble over the side, landing hard and rolling down the steep embankment. Without a second thought, Koso moved. He slid down the slope, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible, and reached the fallen man. The boy was dazed, his rifle lost, his face a mask of terror. Koso grabbed him by the collar, hauled him to his feet, and shoved him into the relative safety of a rock outcropping, away from the main line of fire. Then he was gone again, scrambling back up toward Isaiah. The firefight was short and brutal, outnumbered and outgunned. Koso gave the signal to retreat. They melted back into the darkness, carrying their wounded man, leaving the stalled train and the confused, angry Pinkertons behind. On the passenger car, the judge, a portly man whose face was pale with fear, peered out the window. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded of the lead guard. I was assured this would be a simple matter. "An ambush, Your Honor," the guard said, reloading his rifle, "but we've driven them off." "This is not a courtroom, it is a battlefield," the judge declared, his voice trembling with indignation. "I will not hold a session under these conditions. Signal the engineer to return to San Miguel at once. This hearing is postponed indefinitely." Nora heard the train's whistle, a long, mournful sound. As she rode into San Miguel, it was returning far too soon. Her heart sank. Something had gone wrong. She spurred her horse, racing the last mile to the station. She arrived just as the train was hissing to a stop, steam and chaos enveloping the platform. She saw him immediately. Silas Wexler, standing by the passenger car, his face a thundercloud of fury. His eyes swept the platform and locked onto hers. Two of his Pinkertons moved to flank her before she could even think to run. "Miss Hale," Wexler said, his voice dangerously soft as he approached her, "I believe you have something that belongs to me. Several things. In fact," he gestured, and one of the men ripped the satchel from her shoulder. Another grabbed the camera. Wexler opened the satchel and glanced at the sodden, mud-stained ledgers with contempt. He looked at the camera, a small smile touching his lips. "A woman of your talents should have better equipment," he said. He raised the camera high and smashed it on the wooden platform, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass sharp in the sudden quiet. "Your career as a photographer is over." He turned to his men. "Take her to the sheriff's office. She has a great deal to answer for." As they led her away, their hands gripping her arms like iron bands, Nora felt a surge of cold, defiant hope. Wexler had her. He had the ledgers and the broken camera. But as her hand brushed against her dress, she felt the hard, unfamiliar weight in her pocket. It was Koso's mother's talisman, the small leather pouch he had given her for safekeeping just before she left, tucked securely inside. Wrapped in a soft piece of buckskin were 4 perfect, dry glass plate negatives and the folded, precious pages of her brother's journal. Wexler had destroyed the camera, but she still had its eyes. He had the shadows, but she, and she alone, still held the light. Her escape from San Miguel was a chaotic blur, a miracle born from a single act of mercy. The young Pinkerton, the one Koso had saved in the canyon, had been one of her guards. In the confusion at the station, as Wexler was busy smashing her camera, their eyes had met. She saw not a thug, but a terrified boy caught in a machine he did not understand. He saw the woman his enemy had risked his own life to save, in a moment of swift, unseen action. While his partner was distracted, he had unlocked her manacles and whispered, "Go, now!" He created a diversion, a staged argument with a station hand, and in that brief window, Nora had slipped into the crowd, melting into the night. She ran until her lungs burned, finding her horse where she had left it and riding back toward the one place she knew she would be safe, Thunder Canyon. She found them huddled around a small, smokeless fire tucked into a deep crevice on the canyon's rim. The wind was a restless spirit, moaning through the rocks, carrying the clean, sharp scent of rain that was still 100 miles away. Isaiah Reed lay propped against a saddle, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Doña Luz was tending to his shoulder, her movements calm and efficient. The other wounded warrior was being cared for by his kin. Koso saw her first, rising from the shadows like a phantom. He came to her side, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight, and took the reins of her horse. He said nothing, but his presence was a shield against the shivering that had taken hold of her body, a deep, rattling exhaustion that went clear to the bone. "Isaiah," she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "The bullet passed through," Koso said quietly. "Doña Luz says he will mend. He is strong." He led her to the fire and pushed a water skin into her hands. As she drank, he saw the raw, scraped skin on her wrist from the manacles. He took a clean strip of cloth from Doña Luz's bag and a small tin of salve. Wordlessly, he knelt before her and began to clean and dress the wound. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his large, calloused hands moving with a surgeon's precision. The simple, quiet act of care was almost her undoing. The dam of her control, which had held through capture and escape, began to crumble. "He destroyed my camera," she said, her voice trembling. "He smashed it to pieces." "It is only a box of wood and glass," Koso replied, not looking up from his work. "He did not destroy you." "He thinks he has the evidence. The ledgers were soaked, ruined." "But he does not have all of it." Koso said it was a statement, not a question. Nora reached into her pocket and her fingers closed around the hard, comforting shapes within the leather pouch. The 4 glass plates, her brother's journal, Koso's talisman. She had saved the heart of the truth. He finished wrapping her wrist and tied off the bandage. He finally looked up, his dark eyes searching her face in the firelight. "You are shaking." "I'm just tired," she lied, though it was partly true. "It is more than that," he said. "It is the echo of the fight. It lives in the blood for a time." He settled back on his heels, his gaze turning toward the fire. "I know the feeling, the need to strike back, to kill. I fight it every time we face them. It is a poison." His quiet confession hung in the air between them. Nora watched his profile, the hard lines of his face softened by the dancing flames. "You could have killed them," she said softly. "In the canyon, you are skilled enough." "To kill a man is easy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is a moment's work, but the ghost of that man follows you for a lifetime. I have enough ghosts." He paused, and a deep shadow passed through his eyes. "When I scouted for the army, I did not carry a gun. I carried a map in my head, a map of our lands, our sacred places, our hidden water. And I sold it to them, piece by piece. I sold it for flour and blankets for our children, because I could not bear to watch them starve. I watched my own people, my friends, being rounded up, and I said nothing, because my silence bought another day of life for my family." He picked up a stick and drew a jagged line in the dust, a lightning bolt. "They called me a hero, a civilized Apache, but in my own heart, I was a traitor. I led the wolf to the door of my own home. That is a wound that never heals. So now, I do not take life. I protect it. It is the only way I can pay my debt." His story, told in that raw, unadorned way, cracked open a place in Nora's own heart. His shame mirrored her guilt. "My brother, Daniel," she began, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The day he left for the Mesilla mine, he sent a wire. He asked me to come to the station to see him off. I was busy. I was developing some photographs for a client, an important commission. I told myself, I thought, I will see him in a few months. I will write. There will be other times." She took a shuddering breath. There were no other times. I never saw him again. I traded my last chance to see my brother alive for a picture of a rich man's prize-winning pig. She stared into the flames, the memory as sharp and clear as one of her own glass plates. I carry that with me, every day, the guilt of choosing a shadow over the real thing. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Two souls laid bare by their shared burdens. The wind sighed through the rocks, and in that moment, the barriers between them, of culture, of race, of experience, seemed to dissolve into nothing. Their quiet vigil was interrupted by the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading to their camp. Two old men, their faces like ancient maps of the land, appeared in the firelight. They were followed by Koso's cousin and a few other members of his family, the elders of the Chiricahua. Their eyes, dark and knowing, took in the scene the wounded men, the exhausted woman with the bandaged wrist, and Koso, kneeling before her. Koso rose to his feet, his posture respectful but unyielding. He greeted them in their language. There was a low murmur of conversation, their gazes shifting from Koso to Nora and back again. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the centuries of tradition and suspicion in their eyes. She was an outsider, a white woman, the cause of all this trouble. One of the elders spoke, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves, and gestured toward her. Koso replied, his tone low and firm. The old man shook his head, his expression grim. He spoke again, longer this time, a clear note of command in his voice. Koso turned to Nora. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face and his eyes. When they met hers, held an astonishing, breathtaking intensity. A fire burned in them, a blaze of fierce purpose and something else, something she dared not name. He took a step toward her, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat from his body. He stood before her, and before his family and his elders. He spoke, his voice ringing with a strange, formal power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "You'll wed me, the tribe demands it," said the Apache, eyes burning with desire. The words dropped into the shocked silence, as stunning and final as a hawk striking its prey. Nora's heart stopped. She could not breathe. She stared at him, at the raw, blazing emotion in his eyes, her mind a complete blank. The elders murmured among themselves, their expressions a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. Koso took her by the arm, his grip firm but not harsh, and led her a few steps away from the fire, into the deeper shadows. "Nora," he said, his voice losing its formal edge, becoming low and urgent. "Listen to me. It was not what you think." She finally found her voice. "What I think," she whispered, "is that you have lost your mind." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It is a challenge. It is a vow. In the eyes of my people, I have just declared you are under my protection. You are kin. To harm you now is to harm me. To attack you is to declare war on my family. It is an old way, a shield for those who have no clan to defend them in a time of war. And this is a war." He looked back toward the elders. "They see you as a danger, a white woman who has brought Vexler's wrath down upon us. They would have sent you away. Alone, I could not let that happen. Now, they cannot. I have claimed responsibility for you." He turned back, his gaze searching hers, desperate for her to understand. "But it is a shield, Nora, not a cage. The choice is still yours. It is always yours. I would never force you." She stared at him, the world slowly coming back into focus. The audacious, brilliant, and terrifying nature of what he had done washed over her. He had bound her to him, not with chains, but with a thread of honor, a public vow that put his own life on the line to protect hers. A slow, shaky breath escaped her. She felt a hysterical bubble of laughter rise in her throat. "You certainly have a dramatic way of offering a lady protection. Koso Nantan." She needed time to process this impossible turn of events. But as she looked at him, standing before her in the firelight, offering her his name and his life as a shield, she knew she was not afraid. She reached out and, with a courage she didn't know she possessed, laid her bandaged hand on his arm. His skin was warm, his muscles tense beneath her touch. It was an anchor in a spinning world. "If I do agree to this," she said, her voice still a little unsteady, "the wedding photograph had better be a good one." The tension in his shoulders eased, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips. He covered her hand with his own. His hand was large and warm, and the simple contact sent a jolt of surprising warmth through her. He reached for the leather pouch around his neck, his mother's talisman. He held it out to her. "This is a poor substitute for a ring," he said softly. "But for now, it is a promise. Thunder guards the water. I will guard you." She took the pouch, its worn leather soft and warm from his skin. It was the most precious thing he owned, a tangible piece of his soul. Their moment of quiet connection was shattered by a rider who galloped into the camp, his horse lathered and stumbling with exhaustion. He slid from the saddle and spoke to the elders, his words a torrent of bad news. Koso turned to Nora, his face once again a mask of grim resolve. "Wexler has moved faster than we thought. He used the attack on the train as an excuse. He has a new court order, signed by his judge in San Miguel. It grants him permission to clear the burial ground for an emergency water depot for the railroad." He paused, and the final words landed like stones. "His men will begin burning it in 48 hours. The warmth of the fire, the brief illusion of safety, vanished. The chessboard had been reset, and Wexler had just made his most brutal move yet. The time for hiding was over. "Then we have to move faster," Nora said, her voice ringing with a new, hard clarity. She clutched the talisman in her hand, its stone a solid weight against her palm. "We are done reacting. We are going on the attack." She looked from Koso to the elders, her gaze unwavering. "We are going to Santa Fe." The ride to Santa Fe was a desperate, punishing race against the clock. Nora, Doña Luz, and the young Pinkerton, whose name was William, pushed their horses to the limit, the 48-hour deadline a hammer beating in Nora's mind. They arrived covered in dust, their bodies aching, and went straight to the territorial courthouse, a formidable stone building that seemed to exude the cold, impartial weight of the law. Nora clutched the leather pouch containing her evidence, its weight both a burden and a source of strength. Simultaneously, 200 miles to the south, Koso and his small band of warriors prepared for a different kind of battle. They were not massing for an attack. They were becoming part of the land they were defending. At the entrance to the sacred canyon, they worked not with rifles, but with shovels in their bare hands. Guided by Koso's deep knowledge, they reopened the ancient irrigation ditches that their ancestors had carved into the earth, a network of channels designed to guide the precious water of Red Spring. They laid traps not of steel, but of mud and water, creating hidden soft spots in the ground that would mire the horses of Wexler's men. They were preparing to fight fire with the very lifeblood Wexler sought to control. In a Santa Fe courtroom, under the stern gaze of a circuit judge named Harlan, Nora Hale stood alone. Doña Luz and William sat in the front row, a small island of support in a sea of indifferent clerks and lawyers. Using the simple Taurian, direct language of a nurse reporting a patient's symptoms, Nora told her story. She did not speak of justice or morality. She spoke of facts. "I am a photographer," she began, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "My work is to capture what is real. On the 3rd of August, I photographed a stagecoach ambush. The attackers were disguised as Mexican bandits, but they rode horses branded by the Vexler and Pacific Railroad." She presented the glass plate negative to the clerk. A murmur went through the room as the image was held up to the light. "I photographed the ammunition casings they left behind, which matched the inventory of Silas Vexler's company store. Later, I photographed Mr. Vexler's employees deliberately poisoning Red Spring, the primary water source for the families of the valley." She presented the sequence of plates showing the men dumping the sacks into the water. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Finally," she held up her brother's journal. "This belonged to my brother, Daniel Hale. He was an assayer at the Mesilla mine, a property of Mr. Vexler's. He was killed in a collapse that was ruled an accident. In this journal, he details how he discovered a scheme to defraud the railroad's investors by mixing worthless, toxic ore with the silver. His last entry states that he confronted the foreman, and that if anything happened to him, it was not an accident." Her voice broke on the last word, the only crack in her composure. "The man he confronted, the foreman, is now Mr. Vexler's chief of security. He was one of the men who kidnapped a 10-year-old girl to force her people from their land." As she spoke, the sky outside the tall courthouse windows was darkening, the clear desert light turning a bruised, ominous purple. Back at Red Spring, the first of Vexler's men arrived. They came on horseback, carrying torches, their faces grim in the unnatural twilight. They did not see the defenders hidden in the rocks. They saw only the dry grass and the silent, sacred stones of the burial ground. They tossed their torches. The flames caught instantly. Exploding in the tinder-dry grass, a wall of fire roared to life, orange and black against the purple sky. But as the fire raced toward the canyon, it met the newly wet earth where Coso's men had diverted the stream. The flames hissed and sputtered, their advance checked by the ancient, clever engineering of the people who knew the land. Coso and his men moved through the smoke like spirits, using wet blankets to beat back the flames that jumped their fire breaks. Then, the first drop of rain fell. It was a single, fat drop that left a dark circle in the dust, followed by another and another. The long, desperate thirst of the land was ending. Within minutes, a steady drizzle became a downpour, a torrential, cleansing flood of water from the heavens. The rain hissed on the dying embers of the fire, washing the smoke from the air, leaving behind the clean, intoxicating scent of wet earth. But the blessing was also a curse. The parched ground could not absorb the sudden deluge. The water, which had saved them from the fire, now became a new threat. Red Spring, nourished by the downpour, swelled over its banks. A muddy brown torrent began to rush down the canyon, straight toward the low-lying area where the Apache families had made their camp. Coso saw the danger instantly. Shouting orders, he rallied his men, turning them from firefighters into engineers. They worked frantically in the driving rain, using their bodies and whatever tools they had to build a new channel, a spillway to divert the flash flood away from their homes. It was a desperate, brutal fight against the overwhelming power of the water. In the Santa Fe courtroom, a telegram was delivered to the judge. He read it, and his eyebrows shot up. He looked at Nora, then at the lawyer representing Vexler's interests. "I am issuing an immediate, temporary injunction," the judge announced, his voice booming. "All activities by the Vexler and Pacific Railroad at the site known as Red Spring are to cease and desist, pending a full investigation into these extremely serious allegations." The news, sent by telegraph, reached Silas Vexler at the Cedar Bluff depot. Enraged, his face a mask of fury, he ignored the warnings of his men and rode out into the storm toward the spring. He arrived to see his plan in ruins, his burning crew routed, and Coso's people successfully diverting the floodwaters. The sight of them, succeeding, surviving, pushed him over the edge. He drew his pistol and fired wildly into the air, into the rain, his voice a raw scream of frustration. "This is my land, my water." Koso emerged from the chaos, his body slick with rain and mud. He walked toward Vexler, his hands empty and open at his sides. He was unarmed, facing a man with a gun. Vexler turned the pistol on him. For a heart-stopping moment, they faced each other in the deluge. Then, with a movement too fast to follow, Koso closed the distance, grabbed Vexler's wrist, and twisted. The gun flew from Vexler's grasp and landed in the mud. Koso did not strike him. He simply pinned Vexler's arms behind his back, restraining him with an irresistible, controlled strength. In full view of Vexler's own men, the battle had been won without a single life taken. The climax in the courtroom came just as suddenly, as Nora turned to leave, her heart soaring with the judge's decision. Sheriff Cobb stepped forward, his own pistol drawn. "Nora Hale," he declared, his voice full of false authority. "You are under arrest for the terrorist destruction of the Massilia mine." The room erupted in chaos, but the judge hammered his gavel, demanding order. "On what grounds?" "Sheriff." "On my authority as the law in Cedar Bluff," Cobb blustered. "Your authority," a new voice cut in, clear and nervous, "is bought and paid for by my father." All heads turned. A young man stood at the back of the courtroom, his face pale and strained. It was Silas Vexler's son, Arthur, a quiet, scholarly young man who had always seemed out of place in his father's world. "I was there when my father gave Sheriff Cobb the money," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "I saw the foreman receive his orders to blow the mine to cover up the fraud my father and he had perpetrated. And I heard my father give the order to have the Hale man silenced before he could talk. My father is a thief and a murderer." The confession, so stark and absolute, stunned the courtroom into silence. Sheriff Cobb's face went white. He tried to raise his gun toward Arthur, but he was too slow. The territorial marshals in the courtroom swarmed him, taking his weapon and forcing him to his knees. A state comptroller, who had been observing the proceedings, stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, in light of this testimony, the territorial government is launching a full and immediate investigation into all the financial and land dealings of the Vexler and Pacific Railroad. I request a court order to freeze all assets related to this case." The legal and financial machine Vexler had built had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. The storm had passed by the time Nora returned to Red Spring, leaving the air washed clean. A temporary footbridge had been set up across the still-swollen stream. As she started to cross, the waterlogged timbers, weakened by the flood, gave way with a sickening crack. The bridge collapsed, plunging her into the churning, muddy water. She was swept downstream, the current too strong to fight. Just as her head went under, a rope snaked out across the water. Koso, who had been running along the bank, had thrown it. It landed across her shoulders, and she grabbed it, her fingers numb with cold. He hauled her in, his muscles straining, as he pulled her onto the muddy bank. Their hands, both scraped raw and bleeding from the struggle, met. He held her, his arms wrapped around her trembling body. The water sluicing from their clothes, she looked at their bleeding hands, clasped together. "This is not how I imagined this," she coughed, water streaming from her mouth. He looked down at her, a slow, weary smile spreading across his face. "We still have a lot of wedding pictures to take," he said. A cheer went up from the people gathered on the bank, a ragged, joyful sound of victory. They began to chant, a chorus of voices in English, Spanish, and Apache. "Our land, our water." In the distance, they could see a wagon approaching, flanked by territorial marshals. In the back of the wagon sat a defeated Silas Vexler, his hands bound. The rain had washed the ash and soot from the ancient grave markers in the canyon, leaving the stones clean and bright under a sky that was, for the first time in months, a brilliant, hopeful blue. A faint rainbow arched over the valley, a promise of renewal. The aftermath of the storm was followed by the slow, grinding work of the law. The trials of Silas Wexler and Sheriff Cobb were the talk of the territory. With the damning testimony of Wexler's own son, the irrefutable evidence of Nora's photographs, and the quiet, powerful account of William, the Pinkerton whose life Koso had saved, the verdicts were swift and decisive. Wexler was found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and incitement to murder, his empire of deceit crumbling into dust. Cobb was convicted of corruption and stripped of his office. The Pinkerton agency itself came under a harsh federal investigation, its reputation for brutal, unchecked power tarnished for all to see. But the most significant victory was not in the punishment of the guilty, but in the restoration of the wronged. The court, guided by Judge Harlan's firm hand, ordered reparations to be paid by the Wexler and Pacific Railroad to the families of the valley. It mandated the creation of the Red Spring Community Trust, a legal entity to be managed jointly by the Romero family, a representative from the Apache, and one from the town, ensuring the water would be shared in perpetuity. And, in a landmark ruling, the ancient Canyon burial ground was officially designated a protected historical site, safe from desecration forever. The law, which had been Wexler's sharpest weapon, had become the community's strongest shield. The healing of the land was mirrored in the healing of its people. Isaiah Reed, under the constant, expert care of Doña Luz, slowly recovered. The bullet was removed by a traveling doctor who marveled at the clean wound and the potent herbal poultices that had prevented any infection. Isaiah spent his convalescence on Doña Luz's porch, his deep voice a constant, reassuring rumble as he told old war stories to the children who gathered at his feet. Nora, in a makeshift darkroom at the Romero Rancho, found her own form of healing in the familiar chemistry and the ghostly red light. She worked for days, carefully making prints from the 4 glass plates she had saved. She sent one to William, the young Pinkerton, with a simple note, "Thank you for choosing to be a witness." She gave another set to Arthur Wexler, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible price he had paid to tell the truth. And she made copies for every family in the valley, giving them a piece of the history they had fought for. Doña Luz, seeing the children's fascination with her work, started a new kind of school. In the afternoons, she would take them into the hills and teach them the names of the plants yerba mansa for inflammation, osha root for coughs, creosote for healing cuts. She was planting a garden of knowledge, ensuring that the old ways, the wisdom of the earth, would not be lost. One quiet afternoon, Nora walked alone to the banks of Red Spring. The water ran clear and full now, the scars of the flood already softening, covered by the first blush of new green grass. She had carried a flat, smooth river stone with her from the canyon, using one of Isaiah's smaller tools. She had painstakingly carved 2 words into its surface: Daniel Hale. She found a spot beneath a young cottonwood tree where the sunlight dappled the water, and there she set the stone. It was not a grave, but a memory. She did not weep. She simply stood for a long time, the quiet burble of the stream a gentle absolution. The guilt she had carried for so long, the heavy weight of the unsaid goodbye, finally began to lift, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. She had not been there to save him, but she had been here to find the truth for him. It would have to be enough. She saw Koso on her way back to the camp. He was with a group of the younger Apache children, not in the Canyon of the Dead, but in a wide, sunlit meadow. They were rebuilding a large stone circle, a medicine wheel that had been scattered by time and neglect. As they worked, he was not teaching them the ways of the warrior, but the ways of the watcher. He pointed to the sky, showing them how the shape of the clouds could foretell the coming of wind or rain. He showed them how the tracks of a lizard in the sand could tell you where to find shade. He was mending not just the circle of stones, but the circle of knowledge, healing the wound in his own past by ensuring the next generation would know their connection to the land not as a battlefield, but as a home. That evening, they sat together by a small fire, away from the sounds of the main camp. The air was cool and sweet, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. For a long while, they said nothing, simply sharing the comfortable silence. Finally, Nora spoke, her voice soft but clear in the quiet. "The vow you made by the fire in the canyon." Koso turned to her, his expression serious. "The shield, it is still there, if you wish it to be." "I have been thinking about it," she said, choosing her words with care, about what it would mean. Not just as a shield. She met his gaze, her own clear and direct. "I will wed you, Koso Nantan, if you will have me." A slow, profound warmth spread through his eyes, a light that seemed to come from deep within him, but he did not smile. He simply waited. He knew there was more. "But," she continued, "you need to understand who you would be wedding. I am not a woman who will be content to grind corn and mend moccasins. I am a photographer. I have a profession, a voice. The whole world is my subject, and I will not be put in a cage, no matter how safe or loving it is. I need my freedom. I need my work. I will not give it up." He listened, his attention absolute. When she was finished, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the faint scar on her wrist. "I would not ask you to," he said, his voice a low, earnest rumble. "My people have fought for their voice for 100 years. I would never be the man who takes yours away. A cage made of love is still a cage." He looked from her face to the fire and back again. "Let this be the first law of our home, Nora Hale. We speak the truth to each other, always, and we do not make a choice for the other without asking first. Your freedom is as important as mine. Your path is your own to choose. I only ask to walk beside you on it." The simple, profound honesty of his words was the most romantic promise she could ever have imagined. A tear she had not shed for her brother now traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She smiled, a real, brilliant smile that transformed her face. "In that case," she said, her voice light, "we need to discuss the wedding feast. Fry bread or a proper white wedding cake?" The rare, deep smile she loved spread across his face. "Why must we choose?" he asked. "We will have both, because life is sometimes bitter and sometimes sweet. It is good to be prepared for both." A few weeks later, a new building was going up in Cedar Bluff. It was a small, simple structure, but it was the first to be built with lumber paid for by the Red Spring Community Trust. It was to be a schoolhouse. The day the walls went up, Nora hung the first thing on its bare wooden planks. It was a large, beautifully printed photograph she had made from one of the saved negatives. It showed a figure, slick with rain, pulling another from the churning floodwaters by the collapsed bridge. You could not tell the color of their skin, only the desperate, determined act of one human being saving another. The caption beneath it, written in 3 languages, was simple: "The water unites us." The rhythm of life settled into a gentle, healing pace. The days were filled with hard work, the evenings with laughter and storytelling around the communal fires. Plans were being made for a wedding, a ceremony that would weave together the traditions of 2 peoples, a testament to the new community they were all building. The sense of peace, however, was a fragile thing. A letter arrived one afternoon, delivered by a writer from San Miguel. It was from Arthur Vexler. He wrote that his father's assets were being sold off, and that a new consortium of investors from back east had bought the controlling interest in the railroad. "They are a different sort of men, Nora," he wrote. "They do not use thugs with guns. They use lawyers with smiles. They have already sent an agent to inquire about purchasing water rights from the new trust. They do not want to steal the water. They want to buy it. They say they want to be partners in the future of the valley." Nora read the last line aloud to Koso as the sun set, painting the western sky in brilliant, fiery colors. The words hung in the quiet air, a cold premonition. The war was not over. The enemy was no longer a single, greedy man. It was something larger, quieter, and perhaps far more dangerous. The battle for Red Spring had been won, but the long, slow fight for the soul of the West had only just begun. They were married on a warm afternoon under the branches of the great cottonwood tree that stood sentinel by the now placid waters of Red Spring. It was not a church, but it was a sanctuary, its leaves whispering a benediction in the soft breeze. The entire valley came, a tapestry of humanity that Wexler's greed had inadvertently woven together. The Romeros and the Apodakas stood beside Koso's Apache kin. Isaiah Reed, leaning on a carved cane but standing tall, was there with a handful of townsfolk who had chosen community over conformity. Father Michael had been asked to officiate. He had refused, his face tight with disapproval, muttering about the lack of a proper church license and the impropriety of the union. His refusal, meant to cast a shadow, instead became a source of strength. It was a final, clear sign that the community no longer needed the validation of the old, broken systems. They would witness and sanctify this marriage themselves. Doña Luz stood in the priest's place, not as an official, but as an elder. She held a braided rope of sweetgrass, its smoke rising in a fragrant, purifying column into the clear blue sky. Nora wore a simple cream-colored dress, and Koso a clean cotton shirt and buckskin leggings. They faced each other, their hands clasped. There was no talk of ownership or obedience. Their vows were the law of their home, spoken aloud for all to hear. "I will not take your voice from you," Koso said, his voice deep and steady, his eyes locked on hers. "Your path is your own. I will ask only to walk it with you. I will speak the truth to you, even when it is hard. I will be your shield." Nora's voice was just as firm, her heart full. "I will not take your voice from you," she answered, repeating the sacred promise. "Your freedom is as my own. I will show you the truth as I see it, even when it is ugly. I will be your light." Doña Luz took their hands and wrapped them together with a soft leather cord, binding them at the wrist. "What the water has joined," she said, her voice rich with the wisdom of ages, "let no man, no law, no greed ever tear apart." The community cheered, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed from the canyon walls. Later, as the sun began to dip below the mesas, casting the world in hues of orange and rose, they gathered for the feast. There was fry bread, golden and crisp, alongside a small, sweet white cake that one of the Romero women had baked. It was a perfect symbol of their new, blended world. Dawn, her face beaming, stood on a small stool and read a blessing she had written herself, her clear, young voice shifting effortlessly between the languages of her heart. In English, she wished them joy. In Spanish, she wished them family. And in Apache, she wished them a long life, as long as the river flows and the mountains stand. Isaiah, his shoulder still mending, sat on a log and drew a slow, sweet melody from his harmonica, a song of sorrow and survival that spoke of a pain that was finally beginning to heal. Their wedding night was not in a house, but in a small, clean wickiup Koso had built for them a little way from the main camp, its frame woven from willow and its walls covered in hide. A small fire burned just outside the entrance, its light casting a warm, gentle glow within. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and the sweet desert earth. Inside, there was only a thick bed of soft furs and a shared blanket. There was no awkwardness between them, no hesitation. The trials they had endured had burned away everything but the essential truth of their connection. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He did not pull her closer, but simply held her, a gesture of profound and patient respect. She lay beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, and they watched the firelight dance on the curved walls of their new home. She could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing, the strong, calm beat of his heart against her side. It was the sound of safety, the sound of peace. She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip, and he turned his head, his lips gently brushing against her skin. It was a touch as soft as a moth's wing, a question asked and answered without a single word. In the warm, fire-lit darkness, they held each other, hand in hand, heart to heart. Their union was a quiet, sacred thing, a slow braiding of two souls who had been forged in the same fire. It was a promise whispered in the language of shared breath, a testament to the profound intimacy of absolute trust. It was more than enough. In the weeks that followed, the new reality of the valley took root. The first official meeting of the Red Spring Community Trust was held not in an office, but around Isaiah's anvil. There, they drafted their founding treaty, a simple document that began not with legal jargon, but with a statement of principle: water is life, and it belongs to all who live upon the land. They listed the names of every family, Anglo, Apache, and Latino, who drew their life from the spring. It was their own law, written by their own hands. In Cedar Bluff, a new shingle appeared on a small storefront that had once been a dusty, forgotten assay office. The lettering was neat and clear, painted by Nora herself, Light and Truth Studio, Nora Hale. It was both a photography studio and the office for a small, weekly newspaper she had started, the Cedar Bluff Chronicle. It was a place dedicated to the idea that sunlight and truth could keep a community healthy. She was no longer a wandering journalist chasing a story. She was a chronicler, putting down roots and giving her community a voice. Koso, too, embraced his new role. He was no longer just a warrior guarding the perimeter. The trust appointed him the official water and security coordinator. It was his job to oversee the fair distribution of the water and to be the community's first line of defense against any new threats. But his real passion was for teaching. Most afternoons, he could be found with the children, Apache and Anglo alike. Not with weapons, but with charcoal and slate. He drew for them maps of the wind, showing how a shift in its direction could bring a storm or a drought. He drew the constellations, teaching them how to find their way in the dark. He was passing on the deep, essential knowledge of survival, ensuring that the next generation would be guardians of the land, not just its inhabitants. One clear, bright afternoon, a few months after their wedding, they took the photograph. They walked hand in hand into the sacred canyon, to the burial ground that was now a place of peace. The summer rains had brought a carpet of wildflowers to the valley floor. Nora set up her new camera on a tripod, a sturdy, reliable instrument she had purchased with the first profits from her studio. She stood beside Koso, his arm warm and solid around her shoulders. In the background, the ancient grave markers stood, clean and dignified, the faint arch of a rainbow still visible in the sky from a passing shower. Nora set the camera's self-timer, a small clockwork mechanism that ticked softly in the quiet air. She hurried back to Koso's side and leaned her head against his shoulder, looking not at the camera's lens, but at him. He looked down at her, a quiet, profound love shining in his eyes. The camera clicked, capturing the moment. It was not a picture of a warrior and a photographer. It was a picture of a foundation, of two people who had found their home in the world, and in each other. It was a portrait of a new beginning, risen from the ashes of a bitter fight. That night, as she developed the plate in her dark room, she looked at the image emerging from the chemistry, the two of them standing together, supported by the past and looking toward a future they would build together. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, the truest caption for their story. We chose each other before the land. Then we chose the land to keep each other. The story of a place is written not just in ink, but in water and blood, in the crack of a rifle and the quiet turning of a page in a ledger. Looking back, from the cluttered peace of her own small newspaper office, the air thick with the satisfying scent of fresh ink and cheap paper, Nora Hale could see the narrative arc of their survival as clearly as an image resolving in a chemical bath. It had been a story in 3 acts, each a sharp escalation of violence and stakes. The first was the ambush on the Stagecoach Road, a brutal and theatrical lie designed to terrorize and steal. The second act had taken them into the literal and figurative darkness of the Messilia mine, a descent into the earth that unearthed a deeper, more personal layer of Wexler's rotten empire and the truth of her own brother's murder. The final, desperate act was the twin climax of the stalled train in Thunder Canyon and the battle of truth in a Santa Fe courtroom, a fight waged with both steel and testimony, where nature itself had intervened with a cleansing, terrifying flood. Between these moments of high drama, life had insisted on inserting itself. She remembered the dry, laconic humor that had served as a shield against despair, the arguments over fry bread, the shared laughter over a mistranslated phrase, those small moments of grace. She wrote, her pen scratching across the page of her first editorial for the Cedar Bluff Chronicle, were the mortar that held the bricks of their new world together. Her own journey had been a curious one. She had arrived in the territory as an observer, a woman with a camera, searching for a story, for a piece of the truth about her brother's death that she could frame and put away. She had been a hunter of facts, but the land and the people and the quiet, steady warrior who had first distrusted her shadow box had demanded more from her. She had been forced to put down her camera and pick up a cause. She had learned that truth was not something you simply captured. It was something you had to defend, to build a home around. She had learned to balance the fierce independence that drove her with the profound, grounding strength of belonging. The office door creaked open, and Koso entered, bringing with him the scent of the evening air and the faint smell of wood smoke. He no longer moved with the coiled, defensive tension of a man expecting an attack at any moment. He was still a protector, but the lines of his face had softened. He was a builder now, a teacher, a man who was patiently reconciling the ghosts of his past as a scout for the army with his present role as a guardian of his community's future. The shame he had carried for so long, the terrible bargain he had made to feed his people, was being healed, day by day, in the act of building something that would last. He came and stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders, and read the words she had just written. "You see the world in chapters," he said, his voice a low, fond rumble. "It is how I make sense of it," she replied, leaning her head back against him. "How do you see it?" "As a river," he said after a moment. "It flows from the past, from the actions of our ancestors. Sometimes it runs smooth, sometimes it floods. We do not control the river, Nora. We only learn to build our homes on higher ground, and to know when the storms are coming." He was right. Their enemy had not truly been Silas Wexler, but the system that had created him. Wexler was just a symptom of the disease, a sickness of greed that saw land as profit, water as a commodity, and people as obstacles. They had defeated the man not by matching his capacity for violence, but by refusing it. Koso's insistence on not taking a life had been a more powerful statement than any bullet. Their victory had been forged by an alliance that Wexler, in his arrogance, could never have conceived of, a multi-ethnic community bound by shared interest, armed with the undeniable evidence of Nora's camera and the moral courage of men like Arthur Wexler and William, the Pinkerton who had been saved. They had taken the tools of the powerful, the telegraph wires that hummed with Wexler's orders and the courts that were meant to be his puppets, and turned them into instruments of their own justice. They walked out of the office as the sun set, painting the sky in the same brilliant, fiery colors as the day the storm had broken. They passed the new schoolhouse, where Isaiah Reed sat on the porch, a group of children at his feet, his deep voice carrying on the evening air. Doña Luz was with them, showing them how to braid sweetgrass, her hands moving with the easy grace of long practice. They were a family, not of blood, but of choice, a testament to the idea that community was something you built, not something you were simply born into. They walked to the spring and stood by the small, hand-carved stone that marked Daniel's memory. The water ran pure and clear, its gentle murmur a constant hymn to life. Nora touched the new camera that hung at her side, a tool not of a wandering stranger, but of a resident. Koso's hand went to the leather talisman at his neck, the carved stone that represented his promise to protect the water, a promise he had extended to her. They both remembered the rainbow that had arched over this very spot, a fragile bridge of hope after the flood. They were bound by more than the leather cord from their wedding day. They were bound by the shared memory of fire and water, of terror and triumph. "The men with smiles will be here soon," Koso said, his gaze on the distant railroad tracks that cut a sharp, unnatural line across the landscape. "The new investors, the men who wanted to buy what Vexler had tried to steal." "I know," Nora said. She looked up at him, at the quiet strength in his face. "But this time, we will be ready. This time, we have a voice." She thought of her small printing press, waiting in the office. "And this time, we have a law, our law." She thought of the document signed by every family in the valley, a pact sealed with trust, not money. The old world of brute force and open theft was dying, but a new, more subtle world of contracts and legal maneuvering was being born. The fight was not over. Perhaps it would never be over. But as Nora stood beside her husband, a man who had taught her the meaning of home, and looked out over the valley they had fought for, she felt not fear, but a profound and settled strength. They had been forged into something new. A community that had learned the hard way that justice does not simply arrive like the morning sun. It must be made. It must be written, day by day, with courage, with truth, and with a stubborn, unyielding belief in the decency of people. They had learned to be the light that held the darkness at bay. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below to connect with our global community. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.